Hello once again, everybody, and welcome to the Tournament Poker Edge podcast. I'm Clayton Fletcher, your host here in New York City, and today I have a special guest. Many of you have been clamoring for me to get someone who knows about poker players' taxes on the podcast, so I have listened to your calls for this, and I have gotten someone that is more than qualified. He's the senior manager at Baker Tilly, an accounting firm, a full-service accounting and advisory firm here in New York. And he also writes, I don't even know how many articles for various publications and websites all about poker players and taxes. He also has a website of his own, TaxDood, that's DOOD.com. Please welcome to the podcast for the first time, Brad Polizzano. Did I say it right?
Yes, Clayton. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, cool. So, everybody wants to know, it's probably, now that it's January, it's probably the calm before the storm in your line of work, as most people start to receive their W-2s and 1099s and whatever other numbers you put on tax forms this time of year. And then things probably get really hectic for you in the coming months. Is that about right?
It's already hectic. I think 2019 presents a interesting year for taxes at this moment for two reasons. Number one, we have the new tax law, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which went into effect for 2018. So this is our first filing season that implements the new law. And secondly, the IRS is largely closed as we speak.
Yeah.
Now, the IRS has come out and said that they will begin accepting tax returns as of January 28th, but how many folks will be there to process those returns and issue refunds remains to be seen and when. So it's very interesting times right now.
Yeah, it certainly is. So tell us a little bit about this new tax law. Obviously, most of our listeners probably don't follow laws that Congress passes and stuff as closely as you guys do.
Yeah, and I'll maybe just hit upon a couple of the highlights as far as they could affect poker players in the United States. So for amateur players, and we'll talk about the professional versus amateur difference for tax purposes, but for amateur poker players, this could be a bad thing in that the standard deduction was essentially doubled to $12,000 for single filers, $24,000 for married filing joint. It was about half of that previously, and gambling losses are itemized deductions, which a taxpayer would either claim itemized deductions or the standard deduction on their tax return. But now, because the standard deduction was increased, if they had gambling losses that are less than the standard amount, they're essentially not getting any economic benefit from having those losses.
Right. So that could
there's
that
one
could
impact.
Be a problem. Yeah.
There's a bunch of different things that could affect poker players depending on their particular situation. So I should add the caveat that how the new tax law impacts a particular person depends on their facts and circumstances, because each person's different. But one thing, for professionals, they if they're looking to take business expenses against their poker playing income, the rules were changed as far as deducting meals and entertainment expenses. So entertainment expenses are generally now not deductible at all.
Wow, so that's a huge change.
Huge change. There are exceptions, but if you just think about, entertaining a business contact at a club, the cost, unless you could separately itemize the food amount, and it's reasonable amount, generally not deductible at all. It used to be 50%, but the code, wow. they changed the code to eliminate that. Meals are generally still 50% deductible. They can't be lavish though. So, if you're going to a, 3 Michelin star restaurant that's, beyond what would be an ordinary meal, then that may not be deductible at all, so you have to be mindful of that. One thing that could be beneficial, again, for this is for professionals, there's a new 20% deduction for sole proprietors and partnerships and pass-through entities. But in the poker playing world, for those who are professionals, they could be eligible for a 20% deduction on their business income, which, there's a lot of limitations and caveats to it, which we're not going to go into. But generally speaking, if the taxpayer's below a certain income threshold, then they may be eligible for that. So that's a win for pros.
Wow, so a lot of changes. And one thing we should probably say right here up front is obviously every person's individual situation is unique, and you should consult your own tax advisor before you make any decisions about how you file your taxes. Don't just say, well, I listened to a podcast and so now I'm an expert. We're going to be, I probably would say, barely scratching the surface today. But I wanted to get some information out there for those who are a little bit confused. The tax code is only, 9,000 pages, so I don't know why people are confused, but for some reason they are. So let's talk about the difference between an amateur and a professional. If I'm a poker player, how do I know whether I should be filing as an amateur or a professional?
It's not black and white per se, but you could think about some, ask yourself a practical question. Do I pay for my rent and living expenses, and do I survive off of my poker playing? Because the threshold question is whether the individual is playing with an intent to profit from the activity. Now, there's a bunch of factors, and we're not going to go into those, but that's the real key question. To distinguish it from whether it's a hobby. Obviously the amount of time that's spent playing and the steps taken to improve their play, so on and so forth. But really, are they treating it like a full-time job? Is really the question to ask.
Okay.
One could have other income and still be a professional, but are they treating it like a full-time job?
Right. Like I file as a professional poker player, although I'm also a professional comedian. It kind of depends year to year over which one makes me more money. But yeah, obviously because it's something that I take seriously. But it's interesting to me that there's no set in stone standard. Like if you play X number of hours or if you have this much in winnings, there's nothing like that says, okay, so this is a pro and this is an amateur.
Correct. And in fact, there's a case from the mid '80s that kind of laid out the standard for this, went to the Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States, and it was about a taxpayer who was betting on dog races, and in fact, the year that he was under examination, he had a net loss from his betting. But nevertheless, the court said you could still be in a loss position and it still be your trade or business that you're engaged in to earn a profit. You don't actually have to earn a profit to be a professional, but it's the actions that you take to try to earn a profit that really shines through. Now, if you have, 10 consecutive years of losses, well, that's a sign that maybe you're not trying to change your strategy or otherwise to earn a profit. But but to your point of there doesn't have to be like an income threshold,
right?
That you must hit.
Right. So yeah, that's interesting. Do the dogs have to pay taxes because they're professional? All right. So first question you have to ask yourself is, do I want to file as an amateur or a professional? And again, that's going to be on a case-by-case basis, and it's up to the individual to decide whether he or she meets those not exactly crystal clear requirements. So we're already into some muddy waters, I think. What are the advantages to filing as an amateur, if any?
Well, an amateur doesn't pay what's called self-employment tax on their winnings. So what's self-employment tax? It's the equivalent of Social Security and Medicare taxes if you're an employee and you get a W-2. Professional poker players have to pay that tax when they file, which is not an insignificant amount. It's 12.4% combined, but they can deduct half of it. But nonetheless, it's an additional tax. That now, of course, you're paying into the Social Security system and you get credit for that, but that is one potential benefit from being an amateur. That being said, but I say potential benefit. It may not work out in the end, numbers wise, because it depends on how the amateurs' winnings and losses are in amount. And so what I should talk about for a little bit here is how poker winnings and losses, or gambling winnings and losses in general, are calculated and reported on a tax return. So generally speaking, the tax law requires a poker player's winnings and losses to be tracked on what's called a per session basis. So what that means is essentially each time a poker player has a poker playing session, and we'll get into what that means in a minute, they'll have they'll either be overall up or down from that session. That amount, let's say they're in a positive place, that gets put into the winnings bucket. But if they're down, that goes into the losing bucket. And then at the end of the year, you total up all the winning sessions and separately total all the losing sessions. The winning sessions go on what's called I don't know if the line number has changed on the new tax return. I have to check that, but it's basically called other income on the 1040, and then their losing sessions get reported on the itemized deduction form, or Schedule A. So they get separated on the return. And the thing is that you're basically inflating your income amount on your tax return by only having your winning sessions, and it can affect the how you can deduct other items like medical expenses. So it can, in a sense, artificially inflate the income on page one of the return because it only includes the winning instances. Now you can deduct the losses, but only to the extent of winnings. And again, like I said, the standard deduction is doubled to $12,000. So if your losses are only $4,000, you're not really getting any economic benefit from those losses at all because the standard deduction is greater than that. The long story short is you can't say being a professional is better for taxes than being an amateur definitively.
Right, because they're just different rules for one or the other.
Right, and it depends on how the numbers shake out for that particular taxpayer.
Sure. Okay, so, but yeah, it's starting to become a little clearer. At least for me, I hope for our listeners as well. This stuff gives a lot of people a lot of headaches because it's a little bit complicated, and as we've already seen, there's usually not one correct answer to any question. So generally speaking, if you have a large win in poker, suppose you play in a poker tournament and you win, I believe it's more than $5,000, most casinos will give you tax forms on the spot.
Correct.
I think it's 5,000 seems to be the threshold, right? So if I win more than, say I get 7th place in a tournament and the prize is $9,000, I'm going to get a W-2G. Does that sound right?
Correct.
So I'll get a W-2G from the casino, and it will have my profit in that tournament, which is the prize minus the buy-in and entry fee.
Correct.
So now, if I collect a number of these throughout the year, then I have to put them all in the other income section of my taxes, and then depending on whether or not I filed as a professional or an amateur, I can then deduct the any losses that I had in other tournaments I may have played. So in that case, each tournament would be considered a session for tax purposes, right?
Yes, but let me go back to one other point you said about putting all the tournament wins into other income. You would only do that if you're an amateur. If you're a
Okay.
professional, you attach what's called Schedule C to your tax return, and you report all your winnings and losses on that Schedule C, not as
Schedule
other
C.
income.
Okay,
Yeah.
good.
And then
All right.
the Schedule C captures, all the income and losses from poker playing, plus any deductible trade or business expenses. The resulting amount is then, flows back to page 1 of the tax return, but that is also subject to the self-employment tax. So it's income tax and self-employment tax for professionals.
Sure. Okay, got it. So now one question a lot of people had that they wanted to make sure that I asked you about. Nowadays, many players, especially when they're heading to a big event such as the World Series of Poker or the Aussie Millions or any other huge poker festival around the world, they will ask for backers. So maybe some of their friends will say, okay, I'll give you X amount of dollars for 5% of your winnings, or this amount for 10% of your winnings. How should we handle that in the event that we win or lose, for that matter?
Well, it's key to document the agreement. And I know that a lot of things in the poker playing world is done on a handshake, but that's not what a taxpayer wants to rely on if they're under audit by the IRS. Because, think of it this way. Let's say I'm backing you in the World Series of Poker for half of the entry fee. Oh, well, let's say I'm feeling generous, and I'm thinking you're gonna have a deep run, and I'll back the full $10,000. Okay, and we share whatever the 50-50, whatever you win, and if you lose, then I'm out the 10 grand, right? You following me so far?
Sure.
All right. So let's say you place and win $100,000 net of the buy-in, to keep the numbers simple. So I get 50 grand in profit and you get 50 grand in profit, right? I get my $10,000 back, and so say it's 110,000 of winnings. I get the 10,000 back. Then we split 50-50 the profit. The casino is going to issue you, Clayton, a tax form, a W-2G, for the full $100,000 under your Social Security number. And the IRS is going to get that form that shows $100,000 of winnings to you, even though in reality you only had $50,000 of profit. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Following me?
So far.
Okay, so there is a form that some casinos recognize that if provided to the casino before they issue the W-2G, you could give to them and say, look, this was actually a backing arrangement. Can you issue 2 W-2Gs, 50 grand each, to, one to me and Clayton, and one to Brad, my backer. But not all casinos will agree to do that. Because if they do, then it's fine, right? You have the W-2G for the proper amount, and you just pick up the 50 grand on your returns, and the IRS thinks that you had 50 grand. But what if not? Now you're in a position of having to essentially deduct on, Clayton, on your return. You have to still pick up the 100,000, but then have a deduction of 50,000 for the amount that you paid to me for my cut.
Right.
And you'd have to issue me a 1099 because that's income that you're paying to me. And I mention all this because of going back to the point of documenting. So let's say the IRS decides to audit you and says, okay, how do you, we want you to prove that this expense is legitimate, the 50,000 that you paid to me. If you don't have a document that substantiates the agreement between us, they might say, you know what, we don't think you actually had an agreement, and all the $100,000 is taxable to you. You have to pay tax on that full amount.
And so I would be on the hook for the full amount if I can't prove that you were actually my backer. Right.
Deductions, the burden of proof for deductions are on the taxpayer to substantiate.
Okay. Right. And now, what could that proof consist of? Would it be okay if you and I had just had an email exchange that I could, bring up the emails and say, look, here's an email where Brad says he's going to give me $10,000 for half the winnings, or do I need something with your signature, or what is the standard there?
Well, there's never been a case on on a staking agreement that's gone to court, as far as I know, or sufficient substantiation. One day that could change, but obviously if it's signed and dated, it's better, and it's like it's an actual document.
Sure.
Would an email suffice? Maybe, but I wouldn't want any of my clients to take that chance.
Right.
Because it's just too much money on the line it's just, the added step of, even if they have to pay an advisor or someone just, to spend an hour or two, it's not like we're talking about a complicated arrangement here, to just put it in writing and have the parties, you could even do e-sign. They have that, function nowadays. So you don't have to have people physically signing it. That, the more authentic it looks, the better. And I just, an agreement just clearly states the terms. But look, I realize an email, somebody might say, well, an email makes it clear. Okay. But somebody has to respond to that email and say, yes, I agree. And now you have, it's like two elements of two separate pieces of communication. Whereas for an agreement, it's all contained in a single document.
Right. Right. Now, can I just lift the clip from you a minute ago telling me you'll give me $10,000 for 50% and send that to the IRS? Do you think they'd accept that? Just kidding,
well,
Brad. I'm not
we
going to
could
do
try.
that. I'm not going to do that to you. All right. Well, no, this is super helpful. Now, when I've paid off my backers and issued them their 1099s, does that go as non-employee compensation, or is that wages, salaries, and tips, or how does that work with those 1099 forms, which themselves are kind of hard to fill out?
Yeah. Non-employee compensation would be the appropriate box for a 1099. I think someone could make a case that instead of issuing a 1099, they could issue a W-2G alternatively and put, 50,000 of winnings from the poker tournament. To me, like, whether it's one or the other, I don't think the service is going to care as much, because the bottom line is they just want the income being appropriately allocated to who earned it. But if it's a 1099, then yeah, non-employee compensation.
Great. I told you guys, Brad knows his stuff. Now, Brad, how did you get involved with poker players' taxes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I am good friends with Jay Rosenkrantz.
Oh yeah, Krantz.
That name rings a bell?
Krantz? Yeah, everybody knows Krantz. He's very well known in the poker world for sure.
So he and I go back to 6th grade. We're from the same hometown, and I'll never forget. We started playing Texas Hold'em around that time. We would go to Nathan's.
Sure.
Local Nathan's that had an arcade. We'd nerd out there, and then we'd go to a friend's house and play Hold'em. So we're talking, this was, mid to late 90s is when we were doing this. And, so he and I have stayed in close touch since. And when I was coming out of school, he was involved with Deuces Cracked at the time. And, he's like, and I was getting involved in tax, and he's like, you should get involved in this space. There's a lot of poker players who, some of them start making a lot of money for the first time, and they don't know the first thing to do about their taxes. So, yeah, now here we are 10 years later.
Right. Now, when you would play in those home games after the video arcade with Krantz and the guys, would you claim your winnings on your taxes back then?
Well, in case the IRS is listening, I should probably plead the Fifth Amendment.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, is there actually... No, suppose a player wins $200 in the whole year. So if I add up all my sessions and subtract, the losses from the winnings, and it comes out to some nominal amount, like, say, $200, does that player actually have to file taxes on those winnings?
That's when you say you subtract. So $200 is the net result?
Yeah, say it's a net result of 200 in the positive.
For amateurs, it depends, because if the threshold isn't based on the loss amount, it's based on the pure winnings number.
Right.
If it's, I don't know the exact amount of what the threshold is to report and file, but it's not a lot of money. So if the winning sessions are even just $5,000, that could be enough to trigger a filing requirement, even if their losses are 4,800 and the net would result in 200.
Sure, and in many cases, probably most players, their losses will outweigh their winnings. That's just the nature of poker. Most players do end up losing, but if you have a number of these tax forms, that have been given to you, these W-2Gs, say you have $20,000 worth of W-2Gs for all of the tournaments where you cashed, but then you actually played over 30,000 in buy-ins, you can't deduct negative 10,000. You can only deduct up to the amount that you won, correct?
That's right. Yeah, gambling losses are, I say gambling losses because that's how they're defined in the code and
Sure.
the Internal Revenue Code, and they're all types of, even though some say poker isn't gambling, but I get it. The IRS doesn't distinguish between poker or blackjack or slots or whatever. Anyway, they say wagering transactions are deductible only to the losses from wagering transactions are deductible only to the extent of gains from wagering transactions. So
Right, which is not
correct.
true in other types of business. Like if I own a restaurant and it loses money, I may actually be able to deduct the losses.
Right, and there was a court case in 20, I don't know, it was about, I don't remember the year, but maybe 2010 or 11, that held that poker players who were professionals could, in fact, if they had travel expenses, meal and entertainment expenses, etc., and that produced a loss, they could deduct that loss against and claim that loss and deduct it against other income potentially. But then the new tax law, I had mentioned this about the new tax law, closed that opportunity. So even professionals can't claim an overall business loss from professional poker players, that is, can't claim an overall business loss from their poker playing.
Interesting. Well, it's really good stuff. I don't want to keep you too much longer, Brad, but could you just maybe share with us one or two mistakes that you've seen poker players make as it pertains to taxes? Like, what are the big mistakes we should try to avoid when filing our taxes so as to not attract an audit or any other trouble from the service?
So one is being mindful of paying estimated taxes. So, for taxpayers in the United States, when a taxpayer is issued a W-2G, even if they are, taxes are not withheld from the winnings. So, it's not like you're a W-2 employee where your employer withholds the taxes and then you file your return and you have a lot of, federal income tax withholding. So I think what some poker players don't anticipate early on is that they'll end up looking to file their return in April of the following year, but they didn't pay any taxes during the year, and their bankroll didn't account for that, and they're strapped for cash to pay their tax bill when they have to file because they didn't pay any throughout the year.
Right.
So managing bankroll, but basically the point would be to set aside, to be conservative, depends on what state you live in, of course, for state income tax, but 35, potentially 40% of the winnings, and put it aside to pay. You could pay quarterly estimated taxes. It might be required to pay quarterly estimated taxes based on the prior year activity, so that when you file, you're not trying to pay the IRS on time.
Right.
So that's one big one. Another is just keeping good records of the poker playing activity. So, some casinos could give a win-loss statement, but they're not really tracking how much you're winning or losing at a live table, at brick and mortar casinos. And so it's difficult to prove losses without any kind of record substantiating it. Now, what the IRS says is to maintain a diary of each session, where you played, what game you played. It actually says to list who you played with, which is interesting. You're going to go around asking each person who they are, their names and socials, but and whether you won or lost. But maintaining a diary, it may sound crazy, but this is what the IRS looks for, because substantiating losses could otherwise be challenging. So they're looking for contemporaneous records. That's another big one. Now in the online space, now we have a handful of states that have online poker. The records could be obtained from the casinos. I would still caution poker players from fully relying on the accuracy of those as far as like a year-end situation. And I would still suggest trying to keep track as best as possible on an ongoing basis their winning and losing sessions.
Wow. Okay, great. Yeah, so let that be some key takeaways, guys. If you are winning, try to make sure that you set aside a certain amount of money for your estimated tax bill so that you're not stuck at the end of the year without money to pay your taxes. As you know, poker can go up and down. And also, while you're playing, keep very accurate records. A diary is what the IRS would like you to keep of a detailed account of all of your sessions so that in the event that anything you file ends up being questioned, you will have really clear documentation of what game you played and where, and even as best you can against whom. I mean, mine would say like guy in sunglasses, old Asian lady with jewelry on. I don't know anybody's names, but maybe even that would be better than nothing, just to prove that I'm not, just throwing out random numbers and making it all up.
Well, one other thing I want to mention is, it doesn't matter if you get a W-2G or not. Every dollar of poker winnings is taxable and reportable. So a W-2G is just a threshold for when the casino is required to issue the form. That doesn't mean that if you don't get a W-2G that it's not taxable. If you win $3,000 in a tournament, that's still income.
Sure. Even if you didn't get the W-2G, it's still income, and it should be reported. All right, great. Well, these are really great tips. And Brad, I really appreciate your taking the time to talk with us today and hopefully shed some light on some, complicated questions that poker players who are not necessarily known for being diligent about these things. Hopefully you can help get some of us pointed in the right direction. Now, again, everybody, please do consult your tax advisor before you make any decisions about how you file. You've listened to one podcast, and this doesn't make you an expert any more than it made me an expert, but it did help us get some information. Now, Brad, if we have any listeners who are looking for a tax expert, can we give them your information, or is there somewhere they can go for further help?
I'll give my email address. I'm always happy to chat informally. Brad.Polizzano, Polizzano, at BakerTilly.com.
There you go, Brad Polizzano at BakerTilly.com. And also, Brad, you have your Twitter, Tax Dude, right?
I'm there.
And it's DOOD. Right. Is there a dot in the middle? I feel like there's a dot in the middle. Am I wrong?
There is not. No, at Tax Dude.
Okay, so it's at Tax Dude, TaxDood. So follow Brad on Twitter. Send him an email with your questions. Brad Polizzano, really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Clayton.
So there you have it, guys. I thought it was a very interesting interview with Brad. He gave us some information that we might not otherwise have been privy to. I wanted to get this out soon because I know many of you will be working on your taxes in the coming weeks. Get those 1099s out as soon as possible. If you haven't already, they are actually supposed to be postmarked by January 31st. So no strategy this week, guys. I'm sorry. We will make it up to you with a future episode that will be doubly jam-packed with strategy content. Let me know what you thought about our little poker players tax intro with Brad Polizzano. Definitely follow him on Twitter at TaxDude. You guys can tweet me at Clayton Comic. Also wanted to let you know we do have some very exciting episodes coming up in the coming weeks with many of your old favorites, the TPE pros, who have been so missed in the last month or so when I've been doing lots of traveling. So we're going to get back to basics with some of the familiar voices from the early days of the TPE podcast. Guys, if you like what I'm doing and you like what we're doing here at TPE, please take a minute to give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher or Podbean or wherever else you find your podcasts. It may seem silly, but it is something that really help us climb the ranks in terms of the top-rated poker podcasts in the world. We want to be number one, and that's the goal. Obviously, the competition is very tough, but the more positive feedback we get on those various platforms, the better our chances of being one of the first podcasts that people find when they search for poker. Feel free to leave negative comments if you have negative opinions. I mean, we are certainly trying, but I know you can't please everyone all the time. So for everyone here at Tournament Poker Edge, I'm Clayton Fletcher. Thank you so much for listening.